You're welcome back to class, and this is the last lesson in this module, the first module, that is Scrum, the framework. And in this lesson, we'll be looking at what makes Scrum Scrum. Without taking much of our time, let's jump right into it. In the subsequent module, we would still dig deeper into some areas of this. So we just have a quick overview of what the structure of Scrum is. And here we'll talk about the 353 of Scrum. The 3 roles in Scrum, the 5 events in Scrum, and the 3 artifacts in Scrum. The 353 of Scrum. And the first one is about the 3 roles. We have the product owner role, we have the Scrum Master role, and the developer's role. The product owner represents the stakeholder or the customer on the team. Earlier in our previous lessons, I mentioned that each product is developed by cross-functional teams. And what happens is, for those products, the big chunk of a complex project is broken into smaller pieces, and those smaller pieces would now be developed by a team of developers. We have developers built around each of the piece. So we have the product owner on that team representing the stakeholder. So the role of the product owner is to be the voice of the stakeholder or the end user or the customer. So the product owner is representing the interests of the stakeholders. Earlier in previous classes, I mentioned that in Scrum, we work collaboratively with the stakeholders from the beginning all through to the end. So it's designed in such a way that you have a representative of the stakeholder as a member of the team, and that is the product owner. So the product owner serves as the voice to the stakeholder or the customer or the end users, and also is saddled with the responsibility to set vision and also set priorities. The vision on its own refers to the product being developed. What is the vision for that product? What is the direction that product is going? So the product owner works with the team or works on the team representing the stakeholder or the clients or customers or the end users on the team. And that is the first role in the 3 roles of Scrum. Second one is the Scrum Master role. And the Scrum Master is the Scrum experts on the team. So the Scrum Master owns the framework Scrum. The Scrum Master ensures every member of the team follows the pattern of Scrum. The Scrum Master ensures there is delivery. The Scrum Master ensures the team is able to deliver as expected. In a subsequent module, in precisely, I believe that should be the 3rd module, we would narrow down to the roles of the Scrum Master. But here, we all need to know that the Scrum Master is the epitome of Scrum as a member of the team. So he is saddled with the responsibility ensuring everyone focuses, everyone develops and delivers on the pattern laid out by Scrum. So he is a leader who serves, and he ensures there's continuous improvement on the team. Then the third one is the developer or the developers. The developers are the set of members of the team that will do the actual development. So they are to carry out the work of that development. So in the illustration we've been using before now, building a 2-bedroom bungalow, the developers would be the artisans or the craftsmen, those who are to carry out the work of that project itself. Those are the developers. And they are expected to have the right knowledge to deliver. They are expected to have the capacity, and they are expected to work and deliver quality. That is the 3 roles in Scrum. From there, we'll move over to the 5 events in Scrum. Of course, we've dedicated a module also for these 5 events. The first to look at, let me start from the sprint. The sprint, as I mentioned earlier, is the period in which work is carried out. It's a fixed duration. I mentioned earlier that the sprint is between 1 to 4 weeks. That is the sprint. The sprint is between 1 to 4 weeks. And I mentioned in previous classes also that each team or organization would settle for what duration they want. By the time a team picks 1 week or another picks 2 weeks, that is the model they will stick with from beginning to the end. It is not done in a way where a team would run 2 weeks now, and in another sequence they change to 1 week, and after a while they change to 3 weeks. No, the team will stick with the plan as designed, but just note that a sprint duration is between 1 to 4 weeks. Secondly, all other events happen inside the sprint. Please note that all other events, which I will explain in a moment, all the other events will take place inside the sprint itself. And that is quite logical, because the sprint is the duration where the actual work is done. Then from there we'll move to sprint planning. What's the sprint planning? It is an event or a meeting. It's used interchangeably. It could either be called an event or sometimes called a ceremony, or rarely sometimes also called rituals. So we could make reference to it as Scrum events or Scrum ceremonies or Scrum rituals. All these are Scrum events. So the sprint planning is where we sit down and plan the work that needs to be done in the sprint. In the previous lesson, where I had an overview of how Scrum works, I was able to show us how the team plans what they need to do within a sprint, but we would look into that in much details as we go further. So just note that the sprint planning happens at the beginning of the sprint. And what do? The team members come together and plan the work that would be executed in the course of a sprint, and the sprint is the duration. That's what happened during the sprint planning. Then the daily scrum. A daily scrum is a 15-minute meeting. In some other frameworks, it's called stand-up. So you could hear at different other quarters while it's called daily stand-up. Anytime you hear daily stand-up, is the same thing as daily scrum. It's a 15 minutes meeting. Is an inspective and adaptive meeting where the team members come together to evaluate the progress of work, but that happens within just 15 minutes, and it happens every day of work, and that's why it's called daily Scrum. Then let's move here to the retrospective. Sometimes we call this sprint retrospective, and the sprint retrospective happens at the end of the sprint, where the team members come together to evaluate how they've worked in the course of the sprint, what went well, what did not go well, and how they could make improvements in the course of the sprint. That is what happens during the retrospective. So it's in the retrospective that they determine how they could improve. And the word Kaizen is a Japanese word for improvement. How should we improve? Where they are able to spot an actionable item. What can we improve upon? What would then become the story for subsequent sprints as our improvements? So during the retrospective meeting, everyone comes together to look at the last sprint they've just concluded and ask themselves what went well, what did not go well, and how can we improve. Let me step back to the daily stand-up again, or daily Scrum. I made mention that it's a 15 minutes meeting. In the daily stand-up also, there are certain questions the team members ask themselves, and those questions evolve around: what are we able to deliver yesterday? What did we complete yesterday? 2, what are we looking at for today? What are we delivering today? What are we executing today? Then 3, are there any blockers or any challenges that need to be resolved? Those 3 essential questions needs not be generic, but all the conversations at the daily Scrum evolves around those 3 questions. Then back to the sprint review. The sprint review is when the team members now meet with the stakeholder at the end of the sprint to showcase what had been developed in the course of the sprint. So at the sprint review, the team members meet with the stakeholders, demonstrating or showcasing what they've been able to attain in the course of the sprint. However, that is not the only thing that they do. They also share the progress of work. What did they commit to? What have they been able to complete? What is left undone? And of course, they could now shed some light on what they need to do next. So that happens during the sprint review. As I said earlier, we would going to discuss in details in subsequent module. And in the sprint review, there is a product increment. That is what additionally had been made in that course of the sprint. We check the velocity also. The velocity, we would explain that in further details. Velocity talks about the rate of delivery of the team members. They will also have feedback from the stakeholders. So the feedback they receive from the stakeholder becomes what they would also implement in the next sprint. Lastly, we have the backlog refinement here. However, I made mention of the 5 events. When we count this, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the backlog refinement is not one of the events identified with the 5 events in Scrum. However, it has been recognized as an important meeting also. That is why it's coming in. And we can see the color codes, the slight difference in the backlog requirements and in the other events. And the backlog requirement is to prepare the backlog. We would be shedding more light on this in our subsequent classes. But just note that the backlog requirement is to plan future sprints. When we populate a backlog, I know we will have some more clarity on that. But what I need you to note at this moment is that the backlog requirement meeting is to get your backlog ready for future sprints. Is to get your backlog ready for future sprints. Now from there we'll move to the 3 artifacts in Scrum. The 4th artifact is the product backlog, which I've made reference to a couple of times. And the product backlog talks about the product goal, the vision, and the priorities. So the product backlog contains the items that need to be worked on, the task that the team needs to deliver on. That is what you have in the product backlog. From the product backlog, we'll move to the sprint backlog. And what do we have in the sprint backlog? You have some sets of tasks moved from the product backlog into the sprint backlog. So the product backlog contains all the tasks that need to be delivered to accomplish the product or the projects. All the tasks that need to be accomplished to deliver the product. That's what you have in the backlog. So what you have from the sprint backlog is now the pieces of work items selected. A bit of the chunk you decide to work on in a defined period of sprints. So what you have here is everything you need to do. What you now have here is what you have picked to do within a defined period of a sprint. So the product backlog has the product's goal. The sprint backlog has a sprint's goal. And lastly, the product increment. What's the product increment? Is your deliverables. Is the outcome that you begin to deliver iteratively. Sprint in, sprint out. Your outcome of the sprint would make up your product increments. Again, we would be expanding on all this as we go further in subsequent classes. So all you need to know is the 3-5-3 of Scrum. The 3 roles in Scrum: the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the developers. The 5 events in Scrum: the sprint, sprint planning, daily Scrum, retrospective, sprint review, plus the backlog requirements. And the 3 artifacts: product backlog, sprint backlog, and the product increment. So that will be all for this class. If you have any question at this point, please note them down and send them across to me. I will have some time to give some response. But again, all these that we've seen at this point is what we would be shedding some light on in our subsequent classes. Thank you very much. So we'll see you again in the second module, which would focus on Scrum fundamentals. Enjoy the rest of the day.